Hey everyone, welcome back to Dollar Games, and today we're diving into a forgotten art form, that is pre-rendered backgrounds. Before the dawn of 4K textures and photorealistic ray tracing, video games found a clever way to fake graphical fidelity, and that's through pre-rendered backgrounds. These were beautifully crafted, static scenes that did all the heavy lifting so developers could focus their resources elsewhere. But here's the thing. They weren't just technical workarounds. They were an art form, and like all good art forms, we took them for granted and shoved them into a dusty drawer marked late 90s nostalgia. But now, in the era of endless remakes and semi-open world games, maybe it's time we blew the dust off and gave pre-rendered backgrounds their rightful renaissance. The concept of pre-rendered visuals technically predates the PS1 era. Even in the late 80s and early 90s, early PC adventure games and arcade titles were already experimenting with static, pre-drawn imagery to represent complex environments that real-time hardware just couldn't handle. These weren't just background filler, they were the entire world. A great example is Shadowgate, that used still images to simulate exploration. While early CD-ROM games flexed their storage space and photorealistic backdrops and FMV overlays, it was all about delivering a sense of place when the tech couldn't yet draw it live. By the time Myst released in 1993, the potential of this approach was undeniable. With its surreal atmospheric stills, Myst didn't just use pre-rendered backgrounds, it made them the star of the show. The game offered a richly immersive world not because it was fully interactive, but because every screen felt like a hauntingly detailed postcard from another reality. Players weren't just navigating puzzles, they were soaking in environments too, complex for real-time rendering. But while PC games leaned into the static elegance, it wasn't until 3D consoles hit their adolescence that pre-rendered backgrounds would evolve from a niche tool into a defining aesthetic. And now let's enter the fifth console generation, where polygons were chunky, lighting was experimental at best, and texture warping was less of a technical flaw and more of a personality trait. The PlayStation and Sega Saturn ushered in a new era of 3D gaming, but their hardware wasn't quite ready for fully interactive, high-detail environments. Developers had to get creative to deliver cinematic experiences without asking their consoles to spontaneously combust. Real-time rendering was exciting, sure, but it had limitations. So instead of pushing every polygon to its breaking point, they pulled a fast one. Render the world in advance and just let the characters move on top of it. This sleight of hand became a visual signature. Games like Resident Evil, Final Fantasy VII, and Parasite Eve didn't just use pre-rendered backgrounds. They elevated them into storytelling tools. The still environments were lush, atmospheric, and layered with depth, allowing the developers to guide the player's experience without sacrificing fidelity. Every camera angle was intentional, every shadow painted in place. It was like watching a beautifully directed film where you just happened to be in control of a low-poly puppet. The environments did the heavy lifting, creating mood and immersion, while the hardware focused on animating the character model skidding across the screen like a PlayStation-era figure skater. Alright, let's give Square its flowers. Now, bouquets even. No one flexed harder in the pre-rendered space during the late 90s than Square. At a time when most developers were just figuring out how to texture a wall, Square was busy painting entire worlds. Final Fantasy VIII was especially groundbreaking, featuring looping CG backgrounds where elements moved, like trains rolling through stations, elevators gliding between floors, and fountains sparkling with flowing water, all baked into beautifully rendered video loops. It was like walking through a dream you couldn't quite touch, but that didn't make it any less real. Then came Final Fantasy IX, a visual love letter to classic fantasy with some of the most painterly storybook-like backdrops ever burnt onto a disc. The architecture wasn't just elaborate, it was deliberate. Every stone tower, every crooked signpost told a story. Square didn't use pre-rendered environments as a shortcut, they used them as an extension of world building. And perhaps no game better illustrates this than Final Fantasy VII, where a single static image of Midgar's steel and smog-sprawled environments communicated more about the industrial dystopia than any dialogue could. These backgrounds were quiet narrators, art pieces that anchored the emotion and tone of each scene long before a character spoke. Now, on the spooky side of the aisle, Resident Evil didn't just use pre-rendered backgrounds for aesthetic flair, it weaponized them. While other games use static environments to showcase beauty or detail, Resident Evil turned them into a core gameplay mechanic. The fixed camera angles weren't just there to show off the art, they were there to mess with your head. Walking down a hallway and not being able to see what's just off screen, that wasn't a technical shortcoming, that was deliberate. Nerve-shredding design. Every shift in perspective was a calculated dose of dread, as if the camera itself was conspiring with the mansion to get you killed. The original Resident Evil mansion remains iconic, not just because of its gorgeously rendered, but because the backgrounds controlled how you experience the game. It was cinematic horror without the budget of a blockbuster. Each room a painting soaked in menace. You didn't need dynamic lighting or hyper-detailed models when a single camera angle could make you second-guess every step. That's the brilliance of this approach. The horror didn't come from what you saw, but what you couldn't. In many ways, it was survival horror with a painter's touch. A masterclass in how art direction and game design could become inseparable. So why did we stop using pre-rendered backgrounds? 2 words: real-time rendering. As consoles evolved and flexed their newfound processing muscle, developers started chasing the holy grail of full 3D environments. Suddenly, freedom was the buzzword. Players wanted to swing the camera around like a boom mic operator on a caffeine bender, inspect every nook and cranny, and zoom in on individual pebbles if they felt like it. This level of interactivity came at a cost. Detailed handcraft scenes were replaced with assets that could load and respond in real time, even if they didn't look half as good. The trade-off? More control, less charm. Pre-rendered backgrounds quickly became a casualty of progress. Once hailed for their cinematic flair and artistic precision, they were now dismissed as static, a word that became code for old-fashioned, alongside turn-based combat and paper manuals. Pre-rendered visuals was shuffled off to the retro bin. By the mid-2000s, they had been all but exiled to handheld world, where power constraints still made them a practical choice, or relegated to visual novels and niche genres. The industry moved on, but in doing so, they left behind one of its most visually expressive techniques. While the big home consoles sprinted towards full 3D, handheld systems quietly held the line. The Nintendo DS, with its modest horsepower, embraced pre-rendered and static backgrounds out of necessity, and in doing so, sparked a creative resurgence. Games like Hotel Dusk, Room 215, and Another Code leaned into their visual constraints, using static, stylized environments to create moody, immersive spaces that felt more like interactive graphic novels than traditional games. Even Final Fantasy IV DS brought a touch of this style back, blending minimalist real-time models with carefully constructed 2D backdrops to preserve the game's dramatic flair. The PSP, with its higher resolution screen and stronger GPU, took a slightly different route, dabbling in hybrid environments that combine CG stills with real-time character rendering. Titles like Crisis Core, Final Fantasy VII, and Jeanne d'Arc balanced dynamic movement with beautifully pre-rendered cutscenes, style backdrops showing that handhelds could still deliver visual sophistication without going full open world. But as handheld tech improved, even this artistry faded. Once devices like the 3DS and PlayStation Vita started pushing full 3D capabilities, developers ditched static scenes for freedom, which often translated to more backtracking, fewer camera angles, and a lot more walking through rooms that all kind of looked the same. With the rise of the 3D era, video games entered their blockbuster phase. Suddenly, everything needed to be a 100-hour open-world epic with dynamic weather, customizable armor sets, and enough ambient wildlife to make a nature documentary jealous. Gone were the days of quiet, framed environments. Developers zoomed way out, both literally and philosophically, focusing on scale, systems, and spectacle. The intimate scene-by-scene craftsmanship that pre-rendered backgrounds championed, it became passé, a relic from a simpler time. If your game didn't have a camera you could rotate 360 degrees and a map that looked like a continent, it just wasn't next gen. But in chasing ambition, something else slipped away. It was the atmosphere. Ironically, as games became bigger and more complex, they often lost the emotional weight and specificity that a single screen from Chrono Cross or Vagrant Story could evoke. A meticulously composed backdrop could freeze time, focus your attention, and subtly nudge your imagination in a way no open-world forest ever could. In our obsession with player freedom and procedural landscapes, we stopped letting scenes speak. We were zooming out, sure, but we were also tuning out the quiet power of visual storytelling. But here's the twist. After years of being left behind, pre-rendered backgrounds are quietly staging a comeback. Indie developers, often working with tight budgets and big artistic ambition, have started rediscovering the power of carefully composed spaces. With modern engines and tools, it's now easier than ever to blend 2D and 3D elements in elegant, stylish ways. These devs aren't just chasing nostalgia. They're recognizing that not every game needs to render every pixel in real time to leave an impact. Sometimes the best way to guide the player's eye and mood is to lock it down, not open it up. And let's be honest, the audience is more than ready. Nostalgia is a powerful force, yes, but this is bigger than that. In an era where many AAA games blur into a swamp of generic open-world landscapes and realistic lighting, pre-rendered backgrounds offer something increasingly rare: visual restraint. They let the artist take the wheel. They evoke tone, emotion, and a sense of place in ways that photorealism often can't. Imagine a modern horror game that uses 4K static imagery with painterly shadows to build tension, or a hand-painted RPG where every screen feels like a diorama, not a map. That's not just retro, it's design with purpose. A few brave studios are already picking up the torch, proving that pre-rendered or pre-rendered adjacent aesthetic still have serious creative firepower. Octopath Traveler and its HD 2D style have become the poster child for this revival, fusing fixed perspectives with layered environments with modern lighting and effects. It's not exactly pre-rendered in the traditional sense, but the inspiration from PS1 era camera angles and scene composition is crystal clear. Then you've got Fantasian, from Final Fantasy creator Hironobu Sakaguchi, which goes fully old school by using handcrafted dioramas as literal backgrounds. Real miniature sets scanned into the game. It's a breathtaking love letter to pre-rendered past, and proof that the technique can be more than a throwback. It can be revolutionary. Other indie titles are also making waves by embracing the mood-heavy composition first principle of pre-rendered design. Signalis is a perfect example, a survival horror game that channels the fixed camera dread of early Resident Evil, but wraps it in a grim sci-fi aesthetic with pixel art precision. Its environments ooze atmosphere, and the game knows exactly when to pull back and let its stillness do the talking. Crow Country goes even harder on the retro homage, combining PS1 style character models with richly crafted static environments to nail that late 90s horror vibe. These games are showing that the tools are there, the ideas are fresh, and the audience, oh, we're hungry. We just need more developers willing to ditch the draw distance and pick up the paintbrush. So let's stop treating pre-rendered backgrounds like a relic of the past and start seeing them for what they really are: an underused artistic weapon. Not every game needs to be a sprawling sandbox. Sometimes the best way to tell a story is to freeze the frame and let the player move through a painting. We don't need less technology. we need to use it smarter. Bring back the static screens, the dramatic angles, the handcrafted detail. The backgrounds never stopped being beautiful. We just stopped looking. And if you like this video, please think about subscribing to the channel so you can check out more videos exactly like this. Until next time, take care everyone.